So today we are going to look at what is tendering or what are tenders. You all know that after the building drawings are approved by the appropriate authority, and we have also drawn up the specifications and working drawings are done. The next stage before starting construction is selection of the contractor. Now, how do we select the contractor? And the most commonly used method is by tendering. Now, let's understand what is tendering. The word tender in simple English means to offer. Tender is an offer. Now, the Indian Contract Act clearly defines how a contract can be executed. Simply put, what it says is, first of all, there will have to be some kind of a proposal made by somebody, and then the party to whom the proposal is made has to accept that proposal. But even before that, the proposal needs to be invited. Now, in our case, the owner who wants to get his building constructed will call for an offer, or will invite proposal, or will invite a tender. Okay. And the contractors in turn will make an offer or make a bid to the owner. This offer is called as submission of the tender, or it is a proposal made by the contractor to the owner that if you pay me so much, I will construct so much for you, or I will construct in this manner for you. Okay. And if the owner agrees to these terms, then it's executed. So this is what tendering is all about. Now let's look at what are the various processes of tendering. The most commonly used method of tendering is where owner invites open tenders. Now, open tenders means contractors are given a notice in a public forum, many times in the newspapers, nowadays also on the internet, where we say that tenders are invited from contractors for the construction of whatever, further description. And any contractor who wishes to make an offer can actually send in his tender. This is called the open tender. So there is no bar or no restriction on who can send in an offer. Now there are advantages and disadvantages of this method. Advantage is that you get a very wide variety of people who can actually make an offer or can send a tender or fill a tender. And this allows new unexplored people also to submit their bids. And as a result, the bids are very competitive. Okay. The disadvantage is that many times too many people will send in an offer. Some of them may not be good enough to build. And that makes the job of the architect and the owner that much more difficult, because they have to sift through a lot of data to determine whether a contractor who has submitted a bid is good enough, is competent enough, whether he has wherewithals to undertake construction that the owner or the architect want to have. So the second type of tendering process is called the selective tendering process. Now, in a selective tendering process, what you do is, first you make a short list of contractors who can actually bid, who can actually fill in the tender. And this shortlisting is done based on certain parameters which are preset. Okay. For government jobs, especially in public works, they have contractors who have to register, and they are registered in different classes, A class, B class, C class, like this. and each class has certain parameters. That means somebody who has done a certain kind of work and the total amount of work that he can do, the cost of the work or the cost of the project that a contractor is competent to do. All these are parameters which determine the class of contractor. But in private practice, we don't have that. So in private practice, what we do is usually we look at those contractors that you have worked with earlier, or contractors who have executed works of similar types elsewhere, or you feel are competent enough to take up this job. So once a short list is made, then the next stage is just like an open tender, where every contractor sends in his bid or his offer, and then it is processed. Now, the advantage here, as I told you, is you have contractors who certainly have the capacity to do the kind of work that you want them to do. The disadvantage here is that you are limiting the number of people who can compete. So you are actually not allowing outsiders to compete. And this means that many times the bids that are sent in are slightly on the higher side. Okay, you will always get bids which are a little more than what you would get if it was an open tender. Okay, then there is a third method, and this is not very common, but it still is used sometimes in special circumstances. And this method is called the negotiation tender. Now, what is a negotiation tender? Because the very word negotiation and the word tender really don't go together. Okay, but sometimes what happens that there is some kind of work which is already half done and remaining work is to be done. Now, in such a situation, it would always be better to invite the earlier contractor who has done the work and you take a quote from him. Okay. Or there can be certain very sensitive kinds of construction projects, maybe in the defense, so where security is a concern. You don't want anybody and everybody to enter your premises. So in such cases, you will have to maybe negotiate with one kind of contractor. Okay. Or sometimes there are very specialized jobs and there is, or maybe there's only one contractor who can do that kind of job. So what do? Then there can be no tendering. Open or selective tendering. So in such a case, you select the contractor first, okay, and then give him the bid papers. He puts in his offer, and then there are negotiations across the table where you look at every item of construction and maybe you ask him to tone down, or so it's a kind of negotiation that happens before rates are finalized. So this is the third type of process of tendering. Now let's look at what are the various documents that are part of a tender. Okay, tender documents as they are called. First and foremost, the tender documents are those based on which the contractor is going to decide how to bid, how much to quote. Okay, for this, we have to give him all the information. So there are a few things which are part of a tender document. First of all, the complete set of working drawings. The contractor must know what is to be built. Then, second, detailed specifications. Okay, because the contractor must also know what kind and what quality is expected and what process of construction is to be followed. So we have working drawings and specifications. The third thing that we put in is an abstract. Now the abstract has short description of the item and the total quantity. Okay, the rate column in the abstract is left blank. So it is the contractor who is supposed to quote in that abstract form. In the rate column, he has to put in his rate. Different contractors will put in different rates. And then you calculate, and like a normal abstract, when you make an estimate, you put in your own rates. Here, while submitting a tender in that abstract, the contractor puts in his rates that he has calculated. So that's the third thing. Then every contract document that will be executed with a contractor after he is selected will have certain conditions of contract or articles of agreement, as they are called, which we will study in a later module. So the complete set of these conditions also has to be included in the tender documents, because the contractor must know what are the rules, regulations, conditions, stipulations that he has to abide by. All right. And there are certain conditions which are very important, which deal with how payment is to be made, etc. So the contractor would know how much does he have to invest. Therefore, conditions of contract or articles of agreement is another very important content of the tender documents. Then after that, there are certain other things. For instance, there is a tender form. It's a kind of a letter in which the contractor says that I offer to do your work for this much of amount, and he signs it. So that's the tender forms. Sometimes there are special conditions. Now, what could be special conditions? For instance, the owner says that I will supply cement at 200 rupees per bag. That can be a special condition, right? So there can be special conditions to the contract. Those have to be included. And finally, the contractor also needs to submit a list of equipment that he has and the list of qualified personnel that he has. Okay, this will help the architect and the owner to arrive at the proper selection. So all this is the content of the tender form. Now let's look at the tender notice and how do you call for tenders. The architect has prepared the tender forms. They are with him, a number of sets. Then you give a public notice, and the notice must contain certain things. To start with, it must say what is the type of building, who is the owner, what is the estimated cost, what is the location where it has to be built. All these are very important because contractors will decide whether to send in an offer or not based on all this, whether it's a type of building typology. Some contractors they would say I'm good at building hospitals, so I would rather bid here. Okay. Location, obvious, because most contractors would like to work in a certain area. They have connections, contacts, whatever. Owner, why do you have to give the name of the owner? Because just as the owner has to select a contractor, the contractor also needs to select the owner. Whether this fellow is going to pay me on time or not, what is his reputation in the market, all this will be looked at by the contractor before submitting his bid. So, name of the owner, type of building, cost of construction. You see, usually when, let's say there is a building which costs about 1 crore, the contractor is not going to spend 1 crore and then wait for the owner to pay him. So usually there is about 10, after the contractor completes about 10% of the work, he gets paid. And that process of certification by the architect and payment by the owner may take another 1 month or so. So in between, the contractor may have to invest another 10%. So usually contractors will have to invest about 20 to 25% of the cost, total cost. So whether the contractors have that kind of money to invest or not is something that will decide whether he wants to send in an offer or not. And therefore, the total cost of the work is important. All right. Now, next, what information do we give? We say that tenders are invited, item rate tenders are invited, type of tender. Okay, there are types of tenders. So you have to also specify what type of tender is it. So you will say item rate tenders are invited from contractors of repute. Now, why do you write this word contractors of repute? This is a question that a lot of people ask. Why don't you simply say tenders are invited from contractors? We say item rate tenders are invited from contractors of repute because this inherently gives the architect the power or the authority to not give a tender form to a contractor. How? Because when you say contractors of repute, who decides whether a contractor is one of repute or not? The architect. So this is a hidden way in which the architect can decide not to give a tender form to any specific contractor. Therefore, we add the word contractors of repute. Then, as I told you, all the information. After that, there are certain other kinds of bits of information which has to be there in the tender notice. One, you have to say where the blank tender forms will be available, usually at the architect's office. These are not free. There is a price put on it or a cost put on it. Okay. Now the cost depends not on how much money the architect wants to make, but it is simply the cost of preparing the tender documents, because tender documents will have lots of drawings, papers, etc., etc. So it's a reasonable cost that the tender form. It is also called as tender fee, which has to be paid by the contractor, and when a blank tender form is issued to him. This is non-refundable. All right, it is the cost of the tender. Then you have to also mention between what time. Okay, normally it is better to say between, say, 9 in the morning till 2 o'clock. Sometimes, some architects say tenders will be available during normal office hours. Now, if you say that, there is a problem, because a contractor will come anytime and say, I want a tender form. And your staff will have to stop working and issue the tender form. So many architects keep a specific window of an hour or hour and half, 2 hours for issuing of tender, blank tender forms. All right. Then after having done this, the next thing that you have to talk about is where will the filled tenders accepted. Okay, so you say filled tender forms will be accepted in the office of the undersigned, again between this time to this time, and up to what date, last date on which you submit. Something similar to your submission of your assignments. Only there you don't give any extensions. All right. So the last date for submission, time where the filled tenders will be accepted, they have to be sealed. Then there is something called as earnest money deposit. Now, what is earnest money deposit? You see, a contractor will send in his bid, and if you select him, and afterwards, if he says, I don't want to do this, then all your effort is wasted. So in order to assure that a contractor who bids is later on going to be prepared to stick to his bid, there is some kind of a deposit which is given by the contractor to the architect, and it's called as EMD, or earnest money deposit, to show that he is earnest in doing the work. Okay, this is usually 1% of the total cost of construction, rounded off. Okay, so if the cost of construction is, let's say, 1 crore 3,000, then your earnest money deposit would be 1 lakh. Now, how do you take the earnest money deposit? Not in cash, not by checks, because checks can bounce, but only in form of a demand draft, which is drawn in the favor of the architect, and it is for the complete amount, and it is payable at the city where the architect resides, or city where the architect has his office. So this is the earnest money deposit, and this is refundable, obviously. All the contractors who are not selected, they will get back their security deposit, oh sorry, their earnest money. Then in the end, there is a very important clause that has to be there, and that is opening of the tenders. You have to also say that tenders will be opened on such and such day at such and such time, and who can remain present? You have to say that a contractor or his authorized representative who may choose to remain present. So what it means, that if the contractor wants, he can remain present. It is not compulsory for him to remain present. And If he is not able to come, he has to authorize somebody in writing that this fellow will represent me at the tender opening. And last, there is a saving clause, as it is called. It says that the architect and the owner reserve the right to reject any or all tenders without assigning any reason thereof. That means we are saying that we can reject any tender or we can reject all tenders, and we are not bound to give any reasons why we have rejected the tender. So this last line is very important. It is called the saving clause. Every tender notice must have this. And then obviously your signature, address, etc., etc. So this is how generally a tender notice is prepared. Now we will look at the last aspect, and that is how do you process the tenders after they are submitted to you. So the first thing is, on the day of the tender opening, what you have to do is, in the presence of all those who remain present, who choose to remain present, you open the envelope one by one. Ensure that the envelope contains only the blank, the tender form which is filled by the contractor, and there is another small envelope in which the demand draft for the earnest money deposit is present. So only these two things have to be done, and a good way is to open the envelope, put your hand inside and show that there is nothing inside. Okay, then obviously, because there will be people who may try to put in something else also in addition to the field tender form and the demand draft. Then you have to make a list of contractors who have sent in the bid, then their final figure, how much have they quoted for the total work. Okay, and then in the third column, whether the earnest money deposit is paid, and if it is paid, the DD number, bank name, etc. So those details. And once you do this, then all those who are present sign that statement at the bottom. So this becomes proof that we have opened the tender form and the process that we follow is correct. The next part is where the architect is required to use his skills. What we do is we create a big statement. And in this statement, we make columns, and in the rows, you have all the different items given in the abstract. In front of them, you have the quantity in the first column, and then you have rate quoted by the contractor and the total quoted by the contractor for that item. Okay, then the next contractor, and then the next. So, usually what we do is, when you receive tenders, you number them as T1, T2, T3, like that. And then most importantly, there is something called as R1. Now, what is R1? R1 is reference rates, your own rates. What were the rates that you had assumed at the time of estimation? And these rates you had calculated. So these are fresh rates. Okay. Now, when you do this, what you do is compare what are the rates given by different contractors for every item. And here, the rate that you have quoted is very important. All right. Then what you do is do a total and find out which contractors or which tenders out of these are good enough to be considered. Now, what are the various methods? Some people will say that we will accept the lowest tender. That it's a very bad idea. You should never accept the lowest tender just because it is lowest. What one would prefer to do is have some kind of a threshold. In my own practice, I always use the 10% threshold. That means any rate that a contractor quoted which was 10% above, 10% below the rate that I had quoted, that I had used as a reference rate. If it was more than 10% or less than 10%, I would circle it in the rate. Because what it tells me is that the contractor does not know how to do that item, or maybe he is trying to cheat. So rates which are in a certain range above and below your reference rates, it tells you that the contractor knows his job and he is going to complete the job. Because sometimes what happens is some contractors are very clever. What they would do is they would, for instance, the first item is excavation. And let's say my reference rate is 500 rupees. He will put in the rate as 1000 rupees, double the rate. Okay. And let's say my last item is painting. And for painting, my rate is, let's say, again 500. He will put only 200. So if you and total it up, his bid will be competitive. But I will reject his bid immediately, because what it is telling me, if I read my analysis of tenders properly, what it is telling me is that this contractor is either going to run away after half of the work is complete, because he will have got more money, since the rates that he has quoted for the items executed initially are more. He will take money from me and then run away. He will not complete the work. Okay. So there are these kinds of stories which are hidden in the submission that contractors do, which with experience one learns how to ferret out, how to find out. Okay, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes for that. After a few tenders are analyzed by you, you will know how. Okay, so this is how you reject some of the contractors and make a short list, and then compare the shortlisted tenderers, look at their machinery, equipment, their past record, etc., etc. And you have to make a recommendation to the owner that, in my opinion, T3 should be given the job. If for some reason he is unable to do it, then give it to T5, like that. So you give also order of preference, 1, 2. Don't give more than 2. 2 is enough. Okay. So this is how you make a report after analyzing the various tenders which are submitted. Sometimes some contractors will make a counter offer. They will say that if the owner gives me an advance of 20 lakhs, then my rates I can reduce by 1%. If such an offer is made, or a counter offer is made, or any additional conditions are put, we have to summarily reject that tender. Why? Because the whole basis of tendering is that everybody is playing in the level field. Everybody is applied the same rules and regulations. Therefore, any counter offer in a tender has to be immediately rejected. All right. And then before I end this, once a contractor is selected, the next process is entering into a contract document, which we will learn in one of our later modules. But here there's a very important issue. When the earnest money deposit demand drafts are given to you, you will have to put them in a bank account. And as soon as you have decided to select one contractor, the remaining contractors have to be paid back their money immediately. Okay. Some of the architects, they don't have time. They just put this money in a bank, or they will earn interest on that. Keep interest. When the contractors come, those who have not been successful, when they come to collect their earnest money deposit, your secretary tells them, "Saab abhi hai nahi. You'll have to take an appointment and meet him." And then when the contractor says, "When do I have an appointment?" He says only he can give an appointment, which means you never meet him. Now, don't follow these sorts of tactics. These are very commonly followed by some architects, but as good professionals, you should never do it. One good method is to create an escrow account. An escrow account is an account where you don't get any interest. I mean, you cannot take the interest out. Whatever interest is accrued will remain in that account, and it gets equally distributed amongst people who have deposited money. So it's a kind of a third party account. So one good way is creating an escrow account. Then there is no incentive for you in keeping the money there. You will give it back. Another good method, where if you are quickly appointed, you will not put any demand draft in the bank. You will keep all the demand drafts with you. And as soon as you decide which contractor is going to be given the job, you call the remaining contractors and give their demand draft back to them. That's a very safe way of doing things. All right. In some cases, in demand draft, even a bank guarantee is given, but it is not a very good practice, because in case of a dispute, the banks do not pay. You see, suppose there's a contractor that you select, and he is later on he says, I don't want to do the work, then you'll have to recover that earnest money from him. That amount should be with you. And if it's only a bank guarantee, then when you write to the bank says, no, 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 there was this problem, we can't give you the money. So always take demand drafts for earnest money deposits.